He was the kind of man you'd never look twice at. Quiet, polite, a father who grilled burgers on Sundays and waved to neighbors in the morning. But behind that perfect suburban smile, he was hiding a secret. A darkness so deep, it would wipe out an entire family, his own, in a single morning. This is not just a murder story. It's a story about appearances, about silence, about how evil doesn't always kick the door in. Sometimes it just opens it quietly and walks right in. Welcome to Echoes of Crime, where we don't just tell true crime stories, we unravel the lies. We dig into the minds behind the murder, and we bring you the cases that haunt long after the headlines fade. Tonight, we begin one of the most disturbing, soul-shaking cases in modern American history. This is the story of Chris Watts. And once you hear it, you'll never look at the perfect family man the same way again.
He held his daughter's hand, told her everything would be okay. And then, in the early hours of a summer morning, he took her life, just like he had taken her mother's, and just like he was about to take her little sister's. This wasn't a man in a rage. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was cold, methodical, calculated. The man's name is Chris Watts, and before August of 2018, no one, not his neighbors, not his coworkers, not even his own wife, could have imagined what he was truly capable of. He was the quiet one, soft-spoken, introverted, a husband, a father, a man who kept to himself, worked his job at the oil fields, mowed his lawn, played with his 2 daughters on the driveway. They looked like the perfect suburban family. Shanann, his wife, was energetic, outspoken, and full of life. She sold health supplements from home and recorded much of their life on Facebook. Every video she posted showed a smiling husband, 2 beautiful daughters, Bella and Celeste, and their 3rd child on the way. It was the kind of life people liked, commented on, envied. A life that looked so whole. But behind the perfectly staged moments, Chris was slipping into a double life. He was having an affair, a secret that would become the turning point in one of America's most chilling domestic murders. It started with distance, emotional first, then physical. Shanann felt it. She texted her friends about how distant Chris had become, how he barely touched her, barely spoke. She was pregnant, hormonal, anxious, but her instincts were screaming. Something was wrong. August 13, 2018. Shanann had just returned from a business trip in Arizona. She was dropped off at home by a friend around 2 a.m. That friend would never see her alive again. By 8 a.m., Shanann was missing. Her phone left behind. Her purse still inside the house. Her car parked in the garage. But there was no sign of Shanann or the girls. No note. No explanation. Chris told the police she might have left for a walk. Maybe a friend picked her up. He seemed nervous but controlled. Tense but cooperative. Police bodycam footage from that day shows Chris pacing, offering theories, smiling awkwardly, chatting casually with neighbors. One of those neighbors, though, saw through the act. After Chris left the room, the man turned to police and said, "That guy's not acting right." The next day, Chris gave a TV interview, pleading for his wife and daughters to come home. His voice cracked. His face tried to look sincere. But something felt off. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't broken. He was just performing. Detectives brought him in. He took a polygraph test. He failed miserably. And when pressed, when the walls started closing in, Chris changed his story. He claimed Shanann had killed the girls, and that he, in a blind rage, had killed her. But police already knew the truth, and soon Chris admitted everything. He killed Shanann in their bed, strangled her while their daughters slept just feet away. Then he wrapped her body in a sheet, put it in the back of his work truck, and placed Bella and Celeste alive in the backseat. He drove them to a remote oil site owned by his employer. There, he buried Shanann in a shallow grave. And then, he turned to his daughters. He smothered Celeste first. Then, with Bella watching, he did the same to her. Bella's last words, according to his later confession. Word Daddy no. Chris placed each of their small bodies inside separate oil tanks. Tanks designed to hold crude oil, now used to hide the remains of his own children. Back home, friends, family, and the entire country were in shock. How could this happen? How could someone like Chris Watts, a father, a seemingly loving husband, do something so unthinkable? The answer is both terrifying and familiar. Chris wanted freedom. He wanted a new life. He wanted to be with his mistress without the burden of responsibility. And instead of divorce, instead of honesty, he chose murder, premeditated, planned, executed in silence. In court, Chris showed little emotion. He took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. 5 life sentences, no parole, no way out. But even now, years later, the images haunt people. The smiling family photos, the birthday videos, the ultrasound pictures. They weren't just a happy family. They were a symbol of how evil can hide in plain sight. Behind closed doors, behind I love you, behind see you soon. And the scariest part, you wouldn't have seen it coming. Chris Watts didn't wear a mask. He wore a smile. But this is just the beginning. Because what happened after the murders? The surveillance tapes, the police interviews, the twisted web of lies and manipulation. That's where the story gets darker. And we'll go there. Before the world knew Chris Watts as a murderer, he was just another guy in a small Colorado town. But after his confession, after the truth surfaced, everything changed. It wasn't just the killings that shocked people. It was the calculated way he went about it, the masks he wore, the lies he rehearsed, and the way he almost got away with it. In the days following the disappearance of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, Chris was under a microscope. Police weren't just watching him. They were dissecting him, analyzing his every move, studying his behavior, his speech patterns, his silences, and he was cracking. Inside the interrogation room, Chris Watts wasn't panicked. He wasn't screaming, crying, or even denying. He was calm, too calm. The detectives weren't fooled. They used a method called the read technique, a psychological strategy that builds trust, then breaks the subject with subtle pressure. And it worked. At first, Chris claimed he had no idea where his family went. But when he failed the polygraph, the detective leaned in and said, "Chris, these things don't lie, and neither do you write." Chris began to shift. He asked to speak with his father. And in a moment caught on camera, Chris sat across from his dad, voice shaking, and whispered the unthinkable, "I killed her." He tried to soften the truth, said Shanann killed the girls, said he reacted, snapped. But even then, even in the moment of confession, he was still lying because the truth, the full truth, was even darker. Days later, Chris came clean, not because of guilt, but because the evidence was closing in. Cell phone records, security camera footage, texts, time stamps, all pointing to the same conclusion. Chris Watts had planned this. He had rehearsed it in his head. He knew what he was going to do the moment Shanann got home from her trip. He murdered her in their bed, while she was 15 weeks pregnant with their son, a baby they had already named Nico. Then, with cold precision, he wrapped her in a sheet, loaded her into the truck, woke up his daughters, and drove them all, alive, to the oil site. Imagine the silence in that truck, a father driving to his job site, with his dead wife and 2 children in the backseat. What was he thinking? What was Bella thinking? What did Celeste say? We may never know, but we do know this. It was premeditated, and it was monstrous. And the girlfriend, she didn't know everything, or so she claimed. Nico Kessinger was a co-worker Chris had met at Anadarko Petroleum. They'd started seeing each other while Shanann and the kids were out of town. Chris told her he was separating, that he and Shanann were drifting. He never mentioned the unborn child, never hinted at violence, just freedom. After the murders, Kessinger cooperated fully with police. She handed over texts, emails, phone records. She appeared disturbed, even disgusted, but some still question her role. Some wonder how much she knew, or chose not to know. As for the rest of the world, the case exploded. Netflix released a documentary. Podcasts, news specials, and YouTube channels dissected every moment. People became obsessed with the body cam footage. Watching Chris walk through his home, lie to police, fake his concern. It was like watching a ghost pretend to be human. One moment that still chills people happened during a walkthrough of the house. Chris opened Shannon's closet, pulled down a baby onesie, and whispered, "We were gonna name him Nico." No emotion. No tears, just a line, a performance, but even monsters have cracks. And behind bars, Chris Watts began to talk. He wrote letters, gave interviews, and in those moments, a picture of his mind began to form. He described feeling possessed that night, claimed he didn't recognize himself. That something overtook him, but experts say otherwise. Criminal psychologists studying the case saw a pattern. They didn't see possession, they saw narcissism, sociopathy, and a complete inability to feel empathy. Chris Watts didn't kill out of madness, he killed out of selfishness. He wanted a new life, a clean break, but he didn't want to look like the bad guy, didn't want the world to see him as a failure. So he destroyed everyone who could contradict the image. Wife, children, unborn son. He buried the truth, just like he buried their bodies. Chris Watts now spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, a life sentence inside a 7x10 cell. No mirrors, no TV, only silence and memory, but the ripples of what he did, they haven't stopped. People still visit Shannon's grave, still leave toys for Bella and Celeste, still ask the same impossible question: how does a man become this? 3 days after Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were reported missing, the search officially ended. Their bodies were discovered at the remote oil field where Chris Watts had led investigators, after days of deception and failed deflection. The country watched in disbelief as the story unraveled, one cruel detail at a time. The autopsies were chilling. Shanann had been strangled, the force so brutal it fractured her hyoid bone. Bella and Celeste both died of asphyxiation. Oil was found in their lungs. That meant they were alive when he placed them in those tanks. Still breathing, still conscious, even if only for a few seconds longer. The horror of that fact alone was too much for some investigators to process. What truly unsettled the public, though, wasn't just the murders, it was the calm, the poise. Chris Watts, in the face of national media attention, showed almost no emotion, no remorse, just clean, careful lies. His mask slipped only once in public when he failed the polygraph. That moment cracked everything open. Inside the courtroom, Chris stood silent. No outburst, no apology. When he pled guilty to all 9 counts, including 5 for murder, he didn't even flinch. The courtroom remained frozen in disbelief. Shannon's family wept. The judge read the charges with deliberate weight, emphasizing every life taken, every breath stolen. And yet Chris said nothing. At his sentencing, Shannon's father spoke through trembling lips. He said, "We trusted you. You were supposed to protect them. You took away our whole family." Shannon's mother could barely stand. Her voice cracked as she said, "I wanted to die too. I wanted to go be with them." Those words lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Chris didn't look up. Many believed he took the plea deal to avoid the death penalty. Others say it was a final act of control, silencing Shanann forever, now ensuring he controlled the narrative from inside a cell. But the truth would still find a way out. In prison, Chris began corresponding with people, writing letters, giving interviews. In those writings, he offered new confessions, details the police hadn't released, things no one asked for, things that only he could know. He admitted Bella walked in while he was wrapping Shannon's body, that she saw everything, that she was awake when he drove them to the site, that she knew, that she pleaded. He said she looked at him with eyes filled with fear, that she asked if he was going to do to her what he had done to her mom, and he did. He admitted she fought back, bit down, kicked, that he still went through with it. That was the last time Bella ever saw the sky. Chris also shared disturbing details about his mental state. He claimed to hear voices, claimed he was overtaken by a darkness. Some said he was trying to paint himself as mentally ill to escape the unbearable reality of what he'd done. But even mental health experts remained cautious. There was no history of psychosis, no traumatic event, no hallucinations, just selfishness, just a man who wanted a fresh start without the mess. The letters also revealed Chris's obsession with religion, his newfound relationship with God behind bars. He talked about forgiveness, about being saved, about the possibility of redemption. People were outraged. The idea that Chris Watts, the man who murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters, could speak of forgiveness was unbearable. But it didn't stop him from writing, because control, even from prison, still fed his ego. The Netflix documentary that followed, American Murder, The Family Next Door, put the world on edge. For the first time, people saw the raw footage. Shannon's cheerful videos, Chris's TV interview, the neighbor's hidden suspicions, the interrogation room, the moment of confession. It was all there, and it made everything more real, more personal. Viewers weren't just hearing about the murder, they were watching it unfold in real time through the eyes of those who lived it. That closeness is what made the Watts case so haunting. You saw the baby announcements, the smiling daughters, the home videos. It looked like any other family, and that's what scared people the most. Because if it could happen there, if a man like Chris Watts could harbor that level of darkness, couldn't it happen anywhere? After the documentary aired, hundreds of letters flooded the prison, some full of rage, others full of morbid fascination. And disturbingly, some were love letters, women writing to Chris, offering support, proclaiming his innocence, wanting to marry him. It opened a new conversation about the fetishization of killers, about why people romanticize evil, about how in the age of social media, even murderers can build a fan base. But the ones who mattered, the ones who were lost, could no longer speak for themselves. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, baby Nico. Their names etched into gravestones now, visited by strangers, mourned by millions. And yet, despite all the coverage, the questions never stopped. Could this have been prevented? Were there signs? Did anyone truly know who Chris Watts was? We like to believe we can see evil coming, that it has a look, a sound, a smell. But sometimes evil looks like a husband making pancakes, a father tying shoes, a neighbor waving at the mailbox. Sometimes evil smiles back. And next time we'll take a closer look at the subtle red flags, the patterns that went unnoticed, and the psychology of men like Chris Watts, who kill not out of hate but out of something colder, something quieter, something that never screams until it's far too late. You've been listening to Echoes of Crime.
The horror of the Chris Watts case isn't just in the murders themselves. It's in how calmly, how quietly he carried them out, and maybe even more disturbing, it's in how easy it was for him to hide it. But when people looked back, really looked, the cracks had already started to show. Chris wasn't a violent man, no criminal record, no history of abuse, no shouting matches, no broken windows. He wasn't the storm. He was the silence after it. He didn't explode. He withdrew, little by little, and Shanann felt it, in dozens of texts to her closest friends. She poured out her fear. She said Chris wouldn't touch her anymore. He wouldn't kiss her. Wouldn't look her in the eyes. I feel like a stranger in my own home, she wrote. At one point, she even said, I think he hates me. But no one thought the worst. They told her maybe he was stressed. Maybe the new baby was overwhelming. Maybe things would pass, what they didn't see. What no one could imagine was that the quiet was not peace. It was the calm before he struck. About a month before the murders, Chris started changing. He was losing weight fast, going to the gym more. He seemed energized. Some thought he was just getting healthy. But Chris wasn't rebuilding his marriage. He was falling in love with someone else, Nico, his coworker, and the woman who would unknowingly become part of one of the most infamous murder cases in American history. Chris told Nico he was separating, that Shanann was controlling, manipulative, that their marriage had been dead for a long time. To Nico, he played the victim, the guy trapped in a loveless relationship, just trying to breathe again, while Shanann was away in Arizona on a business trip. Chris and Nico were going out to dinner. He spent hundreds of dollars, something totally out of character, and later it would be that restaurant receipt. That first raised a red flag for police. Days before the murder, Shanann wrote in her journal, I feel like I'm losing him, and I don't know how to fix it. But Chris had already decided, the night before he killed them. He texted her like everything was normal, short replies, no emotion, no fight, no warning, only silence, and under that silence intent, at 2 a.m. On August 13th, Shanann returned home from her trip, and sometime after that, while she was sleeping in their bed, Chris climbed on top of her and ended her life. There were no screams, no struggle, not enough to wake the kids. But in his later confession, Chris admitted something chilling. He said he would never forget the look in her eyes as she died. Then he cleaned up, wrapped Shanann in a sheet, dragged her body to the truck, woke up Bella and Celeste, still in their pajamas, and strapped them into the back seat. They left the house before dawn. Bella asked, "Where's Mommy?" Chris replied, "Mommy's not coming with us." It was the first lie of the morning, and the beginning of something unspeakable. A neighbor's surveillance camera caught Chris backing his truck into the garage at 5:27 a.m. Something he never usually did. That footage would later become key evidence, because it showed his intent to hide whatever he was loading. Then he drove to work, to the oil site, not to start his shift, but to end the lives of his children. At that site, he dug a shallow grave for Shanann, and then he smothered Celeste while Bella watched, and then he turned to Bella. We now know Bella fought back. She bit her tongue, struggled, begged, and Chris Watts, her father, did it anyway. Afterward, he placed their tiny bodies into separate oil tanks, covered the grave, washed up, made a few calls, and drove back home, with a rehearsed story and an empty house. When police came for a welfare check later that morning, Chris acted like he was just as confused as everyone else. He told them maybe Shanann left with the girls, maybe she needed space. He didn't seem worried, didn't seem anything. He wasn't searching, he wasn't calling her phone, he wasn't pacing or panicking, he was just waiting. One friend of Shannon's asked him directly, "Are you worried?" Chris shrugged and said, "Yeah, I'm a little worried." For many, that moment said it all, that emptiness in his voice, that cold, almost bored expression. It wasn't grief, it wasn't shock, it was the sound of a man who already knew what they'd never find. We like to think killers are obvious, that we'll see it in their eyes, hear it in their voice, but Chris Watts didn't yell, he didn't lash out, he didn't snap, he smiled, he nodded, he played the part of a loving husband. right up until the moment he wasn't. And maybe that's what makes this story so terrifying, because sometimes evil doesn't storm in, it whispers, it walks, it smiles good morning, and it kisses you good night. From the moment Chris Watts stepped into that interrogation room, something was off. He was calm, too calm, no tears, no panic, no desperation. Just a guy sitting in a chair, answering questions like his wife and two daughters hadn't just vanished without a trace. The detectives felt it. They didn't waste time. They hooked him up to a polygraph test, and before they started, the examiner told him flat out, "If you had anything to do with their disappearance, now's the time to tell me, because this test, it's gonna know." Chris agreed, he nodded, and then he failed, spectacularly. Not a gray area, not borderline, he bombed it, and when they told him, he didn't argue, he didn't protest, he just sat there, silent, cornered. The lead investigator lined in and said, "Chris, you've got to be honest, because right now, we know you're lying." Chris shifted, he looked down, he asked to talk to his dad, and when Ronnie Watts walked into that room, everything changed. Chris could barely lift his eyes, his voice dropped to a whisper, and then he said the words no father ever expects to hear, "I killed her." At first it was another lie. He claimed Shanann had hurt the girls, that he reacted, that he snapped. That it was heat of the moment, but the cops weren't buying it. They had evidence, lots of it. Surveillance footage, phone records, text messages, Shannon's medical reports, his dinner bill with Nico, the Apple Health app. Everything pointed to one chilling conclusion. Chris planned it. And when he realized the walls were closing in, he gave up the act, he confessed. He told them about killing Shanann in their bed, about loading her into the truck, about waking the girls, buckling them in, and driving them to that oil site, about smothering Celeste first. And how Bella saw it all. He admitted Bella fought back. She bit her tongue, kicked her feet, begged, and then he did it anyway. "Is the same thing gonna happen to me as Cease?" That's what she asked him, and he nodded and took her life too. It was raw, it was horrific, and it was cold. Chris didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even seem all that emotional. He told the story like he was describing a bad dream. Not the brutal execution of his own family. Outside that room, the world was watching in horror. The father everyone had seen on TV begging for their return. He'd murdered them, and not in some crime of passion, not in a moment of rage. No, Chris Watts killed because it was easier. He didn't want to split custody, didn't want to pay child support, didn't want the world to see him as the bad guy, so instead, he erased them. At his sentencing, Shannon's father took the stand. His voice shaking, he said, "We trusted you, Chris. You were one of us, and you took everything from us." Shannon's mother couldn't even speak. Chris, he never looked up. The judge gave him 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for the deaths of his unborn son and the disposal of the bodies. He was sent to a maximum security prison. Isolated, alone, locked up for 23 hours a day. But here's the part no one saw coming. Even after all that, after the confessions, the trial, the sentencing, Chris Watts started getting fan mail. Letters, photos, support, even proposals. Women writing to a family annihilator like he was a rock star, like he was misunderstood, like he could be saved. Why, by now we know what Chris Watts did. We've walked through the crime, seen the cracks, heard the lies, felt the silence. But there's one piece of this story that still doesn't sit right. Something that happened after the verdict, after the world said he's a monster. Chris Watts started getting love letters, not hate mail. Love letters, hundreds of them, some handwritten, some typed in floral fonts with pink hearts drawn in the margins, some with photos, some with perfume. Strangers, mostly women, telling him they believed in him, that they forgave him, that they understood him. Some even said they wanted to marry him, that they could give him the love Shanann didn't, that he didn't deserve life in prison, he deserved a second chance. You might be wondering, why? Why would anyone feel drawn to a man who murdered his pregnant wife and 2 little girls? It's not just this case. It's happened before. Ted Bundy had fangirls. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, got married in prison. Even Charles Manson had a woman who wanted to carry his child. There's a term for it, hybristophilia, the attraction to people who commit violent crimes. It's rare, but very real, and in Chris's case, it went viral. Some letters praised his appearance. Others painted Shanann as controlling or dramatic, as if Chris was provoked, as if murdering your entire family could be explained away. But there's another layer to it. To some people, Chris Watts represented something deeper. The illusion of the perfect man, soft-spoken, fit, polite, quiet. He looked like a guy who snapped, and the idea that someone like that could be redeemed was comforting to them. In a twisted way, Chris became a blank canvas. Women projected their own desires, their own traumas, their own fantasies onto him. And Chris, he responded to some of them. He wrote letters back. He talked about God, about forgiveness, about how prison gave him clarity, how he'd finally found peace. But behind those words was the same man, the same manipulator, the same silence. Even behind bars, Chris found a way to control the narrative, to stay relevant, to make people talk about him, feel for him, follow his name. It's not uncommon in these kinds of cases. Psychologists say narcissistic killers often crave attention just as much as power. And for Chris, the letters were like fuel, proof that even after everything, he could still be wanted. But for the rest of us, the obsession reveals something darker about us. Why are we drawn to monsters? Is it the curiosity, the thrill, the need to understand what seems impossible? Or is it something more dangerous? A belief that even the worst people can still be good. The Chris Watts case shattered the illusion of the all-American family. It forced people to admit that evil doesn't always look like the villain in a movie. Sometimes it wears a polo shirt, smiles in family photos, and whispers bedtime stories to the very children it plans to destroy. There's no satisfying end to this story, no neat bow to tie it all together, just a husband, a father, a murderer sitting in a cell, while the rest of us try to make sense of the senseless. And maybe that's what makes this case so unforgettable. It doesn't just leave you disturbed, it leaves you looking inward, because if a man like Chris Watts could be hiding behind that smile, what else might we be missing? Who else do we think we know? You've been listening to Echoes of Crime. If you found this story hard to forget, you're not alone. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and unfiltered, stick around. We have many more stories to tell, and some of them, they hit even closer to home. See you next time. Chris Watts was sentenced, justice was served, but justice doesn't bring them back. It doesn't fill the silence in the rooms where children once laughed. It doesn't erase the final moment, when a little girl looked into her father's eyes and asked, "Is the same thing gonna happen to me as Cease?" The evil in this story didn't roar. It didn't come with fists or fury. It crept in quietly, dressed as love, wearing the face of a devoted husband, a gentle father, a man you'd never suspect. And maybe that's the scariest part, because sometimes evil isn't hiding in the shadows. It's sitting across from you at the dinner table. It's tucking your kids in at night. It's smiling politely as it plans to destroy everything. You've been listening to Echoes of Crime. If this story left you speechless, share it, subscribe, and brace yourself for what's next, because sometimes it's not the scream that haunts you, it's the echo.